So, good day and welcome back to our last video lecture accompaniment for our course Introduction to Mass Communication Theory, MAX 110, which is being offered online this summer. Once again, my name is David Christopher, your virtual instructor throughout the course. And as I said, this will be our last video to review chapters 9 and 10 as we head towards the final quiz and, of course, coming up on the end of the course. And I'd like to remind everybody, as always, there is a PowerPoint accompaniment that goes along with this video. I will verbally cue you as to when it would be appropriate to move to the next slide. And of course, as always, this PowerPoint accompaniment is available in the same weekly materials week that you can find this video posted to our online LMS, the Blackboard system for this course. So if you're following along with the PowerPoint as you watch the video, I'll invite you now to skip to slide number 2. And we're going to have a look at chapter 9 to begin with, which is a very dense exploration of theories of the effect of media on society. And certainly it's easy to get lost in all that the chapter has to offer, so it's a good idea, I think, in this case, to review what the learning objectives on page 262 of the textbook are. And I've got an image of them, as you can see here on the PowerPoint and as well as the video. So I'd just like to quickly go over those with you. The first one states that, so after studying this chapter, of course, you should be able to explain the social, cultural, and political role played by the mass media, given the interaction between the construction of their content and our consumption of that material. Second, to appreciate how mass media's attention to specific events and issues influences the importance we assign to those events and issues, how we interpret them, how those interpretations come to shape the political agenda, and how some people are moved to speak less openly about them. Third, to better understand how routine news production practices, including journalists' commitment to objectivity at all costs, shape the content of the news and subsequently people's perception of the world. Next, to find value in a number of contemporary mass communication theories that offer evidence of media's ability to produce macro-level effects, such as innovation diffusion theory, social marketing theory, media system dependency theory, and the knowledge gap hypothesis. Next, detail the nature of cultivation analysis and its contribution to our understanding of media influence. And last, to assess the potential for media literacy, interventions to enhance positive media effects and limit those that may be harmful. Now, even with that handy review of the objectives of the chapter, it's still a bit of a mouthful and quite a bit to get your head around, I agree. So once again, for our review of chapter 9, I'll offer a simple review and summary of the heading topics covered throughout the chapter. And so now, if you're following along with the PowerPoint accompaniment, you should flip to slide number 3. And as you can see, I have here a list of the topics that are covered, the primary topics that are covered by the chapter. And I'm just going to briefly go through them with a little bit of commentary on each one, starting with agenda setting on page 264. And we've already looked at agenda setting in a previous chapter. And basically, the idea of agenda setting is how the media, especially journalism, tells us not what to think, but what to think about. And that means that it's giving us, by looking, for example, at a newspaper, a list of what we come to perceive as the most important or newsworthy items simply by the choices made by the publishers of that particular newspaper. And when we go through the newspaper, certainly it seems like all of the news, doesn't it? And by giving us the illusion that that's everything that there is to report, the media establishes what is important or, in common parlance, what is trending, as you might understand it now. Now, agenda setting in the chapter is set in contradistinction to agenda building, which is a little bit of a more nuanced idea. It defines it as a collective process in which media, government, and the citizenry reciprocally influence one another in areas of public policy. And what's important about the term reciprocally in this understanding is that where agenda setting is very source dominated, in sort of suggesting that it is the powers that be, the media publishers themselves and their filtered contributions to media that sort of dominate a receiving audience, whereas agenda building suggests that it might be the audience giving indicators to a newspaper, for example, that's trying to sell newspapers of what it's interested in, what should be trending, and then the newspapers then feed that back to the to the audience, and as such, the audience and the politicians and the media work together in building the agenda which is set by the media. And under agenda setting, there's one other idea that's introduced called framing theory, and that's the idea that people used a set of expectations to make sense of their social world, and the media contribute to those expectations. That's on page 266, and we'll look at that idea of framing in much more detail in chapter 10 before this video is concluded. The next topic from the chapter on page 268 is entitled The Spiral of Silence, Spiral of Silence. And it's defined as the idea that people holding views contrary to those dominant in the media are moved to keep those views to themselves for fear of rejection. And this is a spiral because as the agenda-setting function establishes certain views as popular or dominant, views to the contrary increasingly spiral into silence. And you may have experienced that as well, even in social circles with your group of friends. When something that you like, perhaps a pop singer, becomes unpopular, you become less and less likely to announce that you're still a fan of that popular singer. The next topic on page 270 is called News Production Research. And the chapter actually gives us 4 types of news production research listed on page 270 through 271. And these 4 types identify the study of how the institutional routines of news production inevitably produce distorted or biased content, according to news production research theory. And the first of these 4 types is personalized news, in which stories are framed in terms of the impact they have on individuals, very, very personal individuals. Dramatized news, the way that news is designed to follow conventions of melodrama in order to be more palatable and more commercially saleable. Fragmented news is the way that news is stories are presented to us sort of dislocated from the wider context in which they occur, making different stories seem to be different elements of a fragmented social fabric. And then there's normalized news, which is the idea that news serves some valuable purpose in terms of its information sharing for the audience that it is receiving it. And there's, according to the textbook, there's several reasons for these tendencies of the professionalized 4 standards of news production. One is availability. That is to say, it says reporters can easily find officials. And another is the need to maintain access to these officials. And by offending an official, for example, you may be cut off from the availability of their contributions to your journalism. And in this understanding of these reasons for these 4 types of biased or distorted news, we can see shades of Herman and Chomsky's filters, of which I have included my favorite graphic in the top right corner of this slide. They also talk about in this section the Global Climate Change Coalition, a public relations creation of the world's leading chemical companies. And of course, this is an example of the filter of FLAC, these institutions designed by conservative think tanks to sort of discredit views that are in opposition to their own, and to create a difficult situation to present any sort of contradictory perspective. Now, the next heading on page 273 is called Media Intrusion Theory, and it's the idea that media have intruded into and taken over politics to the degree that politics have actually become subverted, that they're entirely controlled by elite interests. And in this section, there's a really interesting box worth reading on climate change denial. And in this box, it's Gay Tuchman is a theorist who tells us that production practices were implicitly biased toward the support of the status quo. She found that reporters engage in objectivity rituals. That is to say, they have set up a set of procedures for producing unbiased news stories that actually introduce bias. In the efforts to be objective, they create bias. And she explains this by suggesting that when leaders of a controversial movement are interviewed, their statements are never allowed to stand alone. Journalists routinely attempted to, quote unquote, balance the statements by reporting the views of authorities who opposed the movements. However, in this box, in the case of climate change, for example, it tells us that the United States press stands alone among the world media industries in granting legitimacy to climate change skeptics. And therefore, by this professional standard of ensuring there's a balance, that is to say, people who suggest climate change is happening versus people who deny climate change, by balancing these two perspectives, you're introducing a bias. And this is called bias by balance, where not both of the perspectives have equal credibility, and yet both of them are presented by the media, by the standard of professionalism, as balanced in their credibility. The next topic in this chapter on page 277 is information or innovation diffusion theory. And quite simply, this is a theory that explains how information spreads through communities and how the media participates in that spread, which is related a little bit to the idea of social marketing theory on page 279. And it's really the idea of how media can be used for socially progressive ends, following the methodologies researched on behalf of advertisers or political campaigners. And the idea of using media for socially progressive ends, as valuable and noble as it is, it's a little bit utopian, I think we might agree, in a media landscape that's dominated by commercial interests. And the next topic in the chapter on page 282 is entitled Media System Dependency Theory. And it's the idea that the more a person depends on having their needs met by media, the greater the influence that media can have on that person. And this is a particularly interesting idea that's increasingly, I think, both obvious in our social interactions and even increasingly relevant in the current mediated world in which we live. That is to say, media is significantly influential in the way we understand the world. But related to that idea, the next topic on page 284, the chapter introduces the idea of the knowledge gap. And it's a term assigned to better and less informed segments of a society, often based on socioeconomic privilege. And that is to say, certain people that have the availability of media or an education that supports their interpretation of media tend to be better informed in general and have better critical skills than those that have lesser privilege. Also, under the idea of knowledge gap, the chapter introduces the very important idea of the digital divide on page 285, and it's a form of knowledge gap in which access to and knowledge about how to use media is also disparate. Some people have excellent access, internet in their home, multiple media outlets within the home, and they not only do they have access to it, but they also have sufficient knowledge on how to use and interpret the media that's made available to them, while there are socioeconomic and socio-political segments of society that simply don't have the access or the knowledge of how to use this media. And the textbook suggests that these differences are frequently defined by differences in race, gender, class, rural locations, and the like that will create socio-political or socioeconomic disparity. And moving on, it goes on to talk about cultivation analysis on page 287, on how the media cultivates certain perspectives, which is similar to framing, but also has holds out the possibility of cultivating socially progressive ideologies. And then it moves on to talk about media literacy on page 293, in some ways related to all of the ideas we've looked at already. This is one of, in my opinion, the most important topics that the chapter introduces, although it doesn't necessarily highlight it in such a way. The need to be media literate based on the emergence of dependency and because of the knowledge gap, which we've discussed in the list on the PowerPoint slide above, are just incredibly important. Now, Art Silverblatt on page 295, he's a theorist that suggests several of definitions of the aspects of media literacy, and I think two of them are worth looking at. The first one, he says, is the media literacy represents an awareness of the impact of the media on an individual and on society. And the third item in his list, which I think perhaps the most important, he identifies media literacy as the development of strategies with which to analyze and discuss media messages. And if you're paying close attention, you might understand this very course as very much participating in developing the media literacy to analyze and discuss media messages. If you flip now to slide 4 in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation, we'll begin our discussion of Chapter 10, Media and Cultural Theories, Meaning Making in the Social World, which begins on page 299. And I'll be honest, this is perhaps one of my favorite chapters in the textbook. Its very topic is the heart of contemporary cultural studies, and the chapter explores micro-theories as set in opposition to macro-theories. Specifically, it looks at post-positivism and its limited effects propensity, which is a micro-theory, in opposition to more critical cultural theories, which look at society from a more macro perspective. Now, the first topic I'd like to review with you on page 302 is where the chapter begins with symbolic interactionism. That's a theory that posits that our actions in response to symbols are mediated, are controlled largely by those same symbols. The meanings we give to symbols define us and the realities we experience. As we're socialized, culturally agreed upon meanings assume control over our interactions with our environments. And this whole set of theory in the textbook is set in opposition to social constructionism, a topic introduced on page 309. The textbook tells us that what almost all theories classified as culture-centered have in common is an underlying assumption that our experience of reality is an ongoing social construction in which we have some responsibility, not something that is only sent, delivered, or otherwise transmitted by some authority or elite. So it's challenging the source-dominated theory. And nevertheless, the text does define social constructionism as a school of social theory that argues that individuals' power to oppose or reconstruct important social institutions is limited by the fact that people that control the media are elite interested. And I think we can see specifically the differences between symbolic interactionism and social constructionism if we look particularly at the strengths and weaknesses of the theory of social constructionism, listed in the instant access box on page 315 of the textbook. If you look at the weaknesses of social constructionism, number one says it gives too little recognition to the power of individuals and communities. And number two says, in some contemporary articulations, it grants too much power to elites who control media content. And I think that those weaknesses might be considered strengths of symbolic interactionism. And so in this case, by looking at the weaknesses of social constructionism, we can get a clear understanding of the distinction between the two bodies of theory. Now, also under social constructionism, it introduces the idea of typifications. And it identifies these typifications as mental images that enable people to quickly classify objects and actions and then structure their own actions in response to them. And it goes on to suggest that typifications, they operate to some extent like stereotypes, and as such, they may get communicated in face-to-face interactions, but they're propagated by social institutions and serve generally to preserve the power and authority of those institutions. And to explain how these symbols, these typifications, can be polysemic and how they require a common framework of understanding, the text provides two sets of symbols representing a knife. And so if you're using the PowerPoint accompaniment, now will be the opportunity to switch to slide 5. Now, the textbook gives us two sets of images of knives. On the left, we see a set of images that shows how the one word can be represented differently and have slightly different meanings each time. And on the right is another set of symbols that would only have meaning if you spoke German or Spanish or recognized the vague third drawing as a butter knife rather than something else. And the chapter then moves on on page 316, to what I consider to be, I think, the most important topic. It resolves well into the idea of framing and frame analysis, which is outlined a little bit on slide 6 of the PowerPoint accompaniment to this video. And basically, framing has to do with particularly Goffman's idea about how people use expectations to make sense of everyday life. And in this is a discussion of the way we downshift or upshift to less or more serious behaviors, respectively, based on how we are prompted to frame a situation. And the textbook gives extensive examples of how we might inappropriately downshift when we're trying to pass through airport security by making a joke that could land us in a little bit of trouble, requiring quick upshifting. And on page 319 of the textbook, there's a useful graphic which indicates the ways that media framing can inform our decoding of everyday social situations. So on this graphic that's available to you on page 316, on the right-hand side, it outlines the circular process of the way media framing works as we participate in acquiring those frames from the media. And then on the left-hand side, it indicates how once we've acquired these framing ideologies or perspectives or ethologies, how we may apply those even unconsciously to social situations in our everyday real life. And another thing that's identified in this section on framing and framing analysis, which I also think is particularly important, is the discussion of hyper-ritualized representations introduced on page 320, which is particularly in advertising the way that very, very simple or dominant cultural codes are reproduced to such an extent that we become saturated with them and find it difficult to escape our own social understanding of those representations. It gives the very useful feminist example, particularly it says advertising using the sex appeal of women to attract the attention of men could inadvertently teach or reinforce social cues that might have inadvertent but serious consequences. The textbook suggests that advertising that says, buy this beer and you'll always get the girl, in which women are represented as having certain physical attributes and are represented as being available once you have made use of a commodity, may translate into more dangerous and offensive behavior by men towards women based on the hyper-ritualized representations of women in the media, particularly in advertising. And the box in this chapter, a box in this section on framing and frame analysis, gives a really interesting example from the Occupy Wall Street movement from several years back. It says that it contrasts two frames. The frame of the mainstream media and the dominant ideology is placed in contradistinction to the frame of the alternative media that supported the Occupy movement. The textbook says, while the mainstream media used confusion over the event as their dominant frames, alternative media focused on what the demonstrators were actually trying to accomplish. The mainstream media placed the protesters at fault for violence, and conversely, the alternative media sources focused on the brutality of the police and their violent acts on the peaceful protesters. And this gives rise to the next section on page 326, entitled Effects of Frames on News Audiences. And the textbook tells us that exposure to news coverage results in learning that is consistent with the frames that structure the coverage. So if the coverage is dominated by a single frame, perhaps a dominant or a conservative frame, especially one originating from an elite source, of course, learning will tend to be guided by this frame. And on the graphic we have available here, if the learning is guided by an elite dominant source, then our social interactions on the left-hand side of the graphic may well be informed by that single frame. And then the section moves on to talk about post-positivist versus critical cultural approaches to framing on page 327. And like I mentioned early, the post-positivist research generally focuses on limited effects, whereas critical cultural approaches generally look at the more macroscopic effects on society. But what's interesting is that while they tend to disagree on the validity of research provided by each approach, typically they reached the same conclusion, that news coverage is generally framed to support the status quo. And lastly, a last topic introduced in Chapter 10, which you can see outlined on slide 7 of the accompanying PowerPoint to this video. It deals with the commodification of culture, beginning on page 328. And we've already looked at this topic in previous chapters with regards to how children tend to be prompted by the media to become good consumers. Again, this has shades of the Frankfurt School understanding of mass media and the way in which mass media has just commodified all aspects of our social life. And it also has shades, once again, of Herman and Chomsky's media journalism filters in terms of how advertisers and the ownership of media tends to determine the types of content that journalism is willing to cover. And this section then resolves into a final heading on page 331 called Advertising as the Ultimate Cultural Commodity. Before moving on to the critical thinking questions on page 333, which I think in this case, as always, the critical thinking questions are really quite useful. Now, the first of the critical thinking questions is certainly designed to get you to consider the effects of framing that we've looked at previously in this video and in the chapter. But the second of these questions is certainly designed to prompt you to consider advertising and the commodification of culture. The question asks, advertisers, through product positioning, make extensive use of symbolic interaction. Can you look around your life and find products, symbols that you have intentionally acquired specifically to position yourself in others' meaning making of you, as in your identity construction? The question asks, for example, what car do you drive and why? You might also consider, what kind of iPhone do you have? What sort of clothes do you wear? It says, do you favor a specific scent or a brand of clothes? And what reality are you trying to create with such product choices? And both of these questions, I think, are number one and number two, are really worth thinking about. Again, there's no assignment attached to these considerations, but it's an opportunity to put some of the theory that is in Chapter 10, apply it to situations in your own life, which might give it a little bit more meaning and make it a little easier to remember as we head in towards the final quiz. So that's all I have in the way of video accompaniment for the course. I hope that these videos have assisted your understanding, or at least focused some of the important concepts that have been presented throughout the course via the textbook. And I'd like to wish everyone good luck with your final submissions, for those of you that have some left, and with the final quiz. Now, I look forward to meeting some of you on campus as the opportunities arise.